The blizzard had rolled in without warning, a wall of white swallowing the ridge and the scrubland below. Snow slanted sideways under a wind that howled like a woman grieving. The horses had gone still in the lean-to, huddled flank to flank, and the chimney smoked hard against the gale. Me Whitlock, wrapped in her father's patched duster and her own silence, watched the storm from the window of her kitchen. It was too early in the season for this kind of cold. October had just turned its face to November, and already the land was closing its eyes. She'd been chopping turnips when the dog barked. Nash wasn't one to bark unless it mattered. The hound was old, gray around the muzzle, slow to stir. But he stood now at the door with his ears stiff and a low rumble in his throat. Me reached for the shotgun above the hearth, her pulse a quiet thunder under her ribs. She opened the door a crack. What staggered out of the snow didn't look like it had any business still breathing. He collapsed before he reached the porch steps. Just fell forward, face first into the drift like he'd been dropped by something greater than gravity. Me kept the barrel leveled as she approached, Nash growling low at her heel. When she turned him over, her breath caught. The man was half frozen, lips blue, blood crusted along his hairline. His coat was torn, and one side of his shirt soaked through with something darker than snowmelt. But what made her knees lock wasn't the wound. It was what he muttered as she leaned close to listen for breath. "Eli," he rasped, "tell Eli I'm sorry." Her son's name didn't belong in the mouth of a dying stranger. She didn't carry him in, not at first. Me dragged his limp body beneath the porch awning and rolled him onto an old feed sack, teeth clenched against the raw cold slicing through her gloves. She stared at him a long while, uncertain. There was no logic to it. No kindness left in her to spare for men she didn't know, not after what the world had taken. But that name, spoken like a prayer, a confession, a promise. She went inside and lit the stove higher. Hours passed before she brought him in. She waited until the snow had sealed the world shut and escape was a fantasy. Then, without ceremony, she dragged him across the threshold, leaving a trail of wet behind her. Nash whined but didn't stop her. She laid the stranger on her son's old cot, stripped the soaked shirt from his back, and saw the truth carved into flesh, bullet wound, recent but not fresh, fevered sweat on his brow, skin pale as milk. Me stitched him without asking who he was. Her fingers were steady. She had practice. The wound wasn't clean, but it hadn't torn anything vital. He might live if the fever broke, might die in his sleep just as easy. She didn't pray. The house felt smaller with him in it, the silence deeper. She kept to her side of it, tending the fire, heating broth, mending the torn hem of a coat Eli had left behind when he still came home sometimes. Her thoughts tangled like thread in wind. That night, as snow howled against the window panes and shadows shifted in the corners, he woke. Me had dozed beside the hearth, but Nash's growl brought her back quick. The man blinked up at her, hollow-eyed, sweat on his brow. His voice was ragged as torn bark. "Where am I?" Me didn't answer. She poured water into a tin cup and brought it to him, wordless. He drank slow, eyes never leaving hers. There was something broken in them, something trying not to be. "Thank you," he rasped. She said nothing. He looked around like the walls might speak. Then, softer, like he feared the answer, "Did I say a name?" She didn't move. "Eli," she said finally, "you said his name." The man closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked more haunted than hurt. "Didn't mean to," he whispered. Me leaned back, the chair creaked under her. "You know my son." "I did." The words came slow, weighted. "He saved my life once." Me studied him. In the flickering firelight, he looked younger than she'd thought, not more than 30, the kind of young that had been aged wrong, worn too hard by the world. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then coughed, winced. "Call me Jonah." Jonah, a name for men swallowed by storms and spit back into the world broken. Me nodded once and rose. She banked the fire higher and left him to the dark. Upstairs, in the room Eli had once slept in, she sat on the edge of a narrow bed and stared at the shuttered window. She did not sleep. Outside, the wind sang like grief. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the world was quiet in that unnerving way it gets after a storm, as if everything still breathed but had forgotten how to speak. Frost feathered the edges of the windows. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Me stood at the stove, stirring oats and listening to the creak of old timber settle around her. She hadn't meant to keep him. Jonah lay still in the cot, his chest rising slow, shallow. Fever had not yet broken, but neither had it taken him. She placed the bowl on the table and moved to his side with the steady, cautious steps of someone tending both injury and instinct. He opened his eyes before she touched him. "You're still here," he murmured. She didn't answer. Me fed him slow, one spoonful at a time, like she used to when Eli was small and sick from river water. Jonah's hands trembled too hard to lift the bowl himself, so she did it for him, not meeting his gaze. His skin burned beneath the touch, but his voice, when it came, was cooler now, less jagged. "Why'd you let me in?" Me's jaw worked. She didn't owe him words, but something in his tone wasn't seeking comfort, just truth. "You said my son's name," she replied, flat. Jonah winced, whether from the name or the wound she couldn't tell. "I wasn't sure I dreamed it." She wiped his mouth with the corner of a rag. "You didn't." They spoke no more that morning. When he slept again, Me slipped outside to check the livestock. Snow had drifted up to the barn door. She shoveled in silence, her breath pluming, the ache in her shoulders welcome. The chores steadied her, gave her something solid to hold. By noon, the sky turned a brittle blue, and ice began to melt in slow rivulets from the eaves. She found him trying to sit up when she returned, the blanket tangled around his legs like a snare. "You're a damn fool," she muttered, setting down the pail of water with a thud. "Not the first time I've heard that." Me moved to his side and helped him lean back. His weight against her shoulder startled them both. He smelled like iron and sweat, and something else buried deeper, something like cedar smoke. "Izzy," she said, "I should go. You won't make it to the gate." Jonah coughed, bitter with phlegm. "Maybe that be better." Me stood, hands on her hips, jaw set. "You think dying in a snowbank makes you brave?" He didn't answer. The next days passed in half-light and labor. She kept the fire fed, milked the goat, mended an old fence torn down by wind. Jonah drifted in and out of fevered sleep, murmuring things she didn't always catch. Names, please. Once, he whispered a song she hadn't heard in years, an old hymn Eli used to hum when he thought she wasn't listening. On the fourth day, he asked about Eli. "He's still alive." May stiffened. "That's not a question you've earned." Jonah nodded, eyes hollow, fair. But that night, she found herself sitting beside him, spinning the tale she never meant to tell. "He left 5 years ago," she said. "Took his rifle and his father's horse and went looking for something he never named. I haven't seen him since." Jonah listened without speaking. "He wrote for a time," she went on, "letters that smelled like dust and guilt, said he was heading south then east, said he was fine." She paused. Then he stopped writing. Jonah looked at her with something that might have been sorrow, might have been shame. "I saw him last near El Paso," he said, voice a gravel whisper. "He was riding with men who thought they were doing good, or tried to, got tangled in something bigger than any of us." Me's hand clenched in her lap. "You rode with him." Jonah's eyes didn't waver. "I rode behind him, tried to keep up." She said nothing. Silence stretched long between them, broken only by the hiss of wind along the chimney flue. "What happened?" she asked at last. Jonah's jaw worked, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "He saved my life," he said finally. "Paid for it in blood. I don't know if he lived." Me looked away. Her breath hitched in her chest, but she pressed it down like she had with every grief that came before. She stood and left him there, the fire's light casting long shadows across the floor. That night Me didn't sleep. She sat by the window, eyes on the moonlit snow, waiting for memory to loosen its grip. When dawn came, she was still watching. By the time the snow began to melt in earnest, Jonah could walk short distances, leaning heavy on the cane Me had carved from a branch of the twisted pinyon tree near the bluff. He didn't thank her for it. He just took it in hand like he understood what it cost to give a man something that kept him upright. Me didn't ask him to leave. He slept in Eli's cot still, ate at her table, kept his voice low and his presence smaller. In the evenings, he helped stack wood, slow and stiff-limbed. Some days he followed her out to the pasture and stood quiet while she salted the feed or mended fences. He never offered stories and she didn't press. But the silence between them began to shift. It wasn't empty now. It had weight, shape. One morning, while cleaning the rifle that had once belonged to her husband, me caught him staring at the burnished stock. "You ever fire one like it?" she asked. He nodded once, years ago. Before Eli. Before I had a name worth keeping. She didn't look up. That why you ran with thieves? Jonah flinched, but not from the question. It's not always stealing when you take back what was taken first. Me paused, fingers stilling on the cleaning rod. "We robbed a man who bought children," he said, voice even. "Eli helped burn the place to the ground." She set the rifle down with a careful hand. That night Jonah built the fire without being asked. She watched him from the doorway, arms folded, heart tight. He moved like someone raised with duty pressed into his bones, but warped somewhere along the way. Bent, not broken. Later, as she scrubbed the floor with hot water and lye, me found herself humming. A tune Eli used to whistle when fixing tack in the barn. She stopped halfway through, caught off guard by the sound of her own voice. "You sound like him," Jonah said from the stairs. Me looked up. He got that song from his father. Jonah eased down onto the last step, knees stiff. His father still alive. "No." Jonah waited, but she offered nothing more. Some grief was meant to be buried under frost and fence posts. Spring crept in under the door like a wary guest. Snow gave way to mud, and the trees around the creek swelled with swollen buds. Me began planting again, spinach, onion sets, beets. She found herself setting 2 places at the table without thinking. One morning she rose to find Jonah already outside, splitting kindling with her old hatchet. His face was pale, sweat beading at his brow, but his grip on the handle was sure. "You should be resting," she called. "I've done enough of that." Me leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I'm not a man who's used to being cared for," he said after a pause. "Neither am I." He set down the hatchet, breathing hard. "I owe you more than I can say." She looked past him, toward the hills still dusted with the last stubborn snows. "Maybe you do, maybe you don't." Jonah turned toward her, something in his eyes flickering between sorrow and gratitude. "I never told you what happened that day," he said. "May didn't move. We were ambushed, government men or mercenaries who worked like 'em. They were after the ledgers we'd taken, proof of the trade, names, buyers. Eli ran interference so I could get away. Rode straight into their line, drew fire, then vanished in the dust." Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. "And you ran." "I did," Jonah said, his voice raw. "I looked for him after, for days, found blood, found his horse shot in the flank, but no body." Me's breath trembled. "And you left him." Jonah stepped forward, slow, unarmed. "I've never stopped carrying it." She turned away, jaw clenched, and went back inside. Her hands shook as she stirred the morning porridge, but her eyes stayed dry. That night she left the door unlatched. And in the dark, long after the fire burned down, she heard Jonah rise from his bed and place a blanket over her shoulders where she dozed in the chair. He did not speak. She did not move. But the silence between them held something new. The rains came early that year, soaking the earth until the hillsides wept and the creek at the bottom of Me's land ran swift and dark. Roots swelled. Paths turned to soup. Jonah rigged a crude footbridge from split boards and rope so Me wouldn't risk slipping on the stones, though she hadn't asked for it. She watched him lash the last board with a knot Eli used to favor and felt something shift deep in her ribs, a tightness uncoiling. They worked in tandem now. He mended the barn's sagging door, she patched the roof. He trimmed the orchard's dead limbs, she planted peas beneath them. The rhythm of labor wove a kind of fragile peace, each task a truce. One afternoon, while untangling a rusted bit from a bundle of tack, Jonah held up a length of rawhide and asked, "Did he ride Western or cavalry?" Me paused at the forge, sweat on her brow. "Mixed, he liked the control of cavalry, but he never had the patience for ceremony." Jonah grinned faintly. "Sounds right." There was a tenderness in the way he spoke of her boy, no embellishment, no sorrow wrung into poetry. Just the plain, quiet reverence of someone who had once followed a better man into fire. Later that week, while Me trimmed the goat's hooves, Jonah crouched beside the fence, turning a pocket knife in his palm. He carved small figures when his hands needed to be busy. Birds, mostly. One with outstretched wings he gave to me without comment, and she set it on the sill above the sink. Nash, the old hound, had taken to sleeping by Jonah's cot. In early May, they rode to town together. Supplies were low, and me wouldn't risk going alone with rumors of travelers turning up robbed along the mountain road. Jonah wore his coat buttoned high and kept his hand near the revolver she'd lent him. They didn't speak much on the ride, but something about their silence had changed. It didn't press between them like it used to. It filled the space like wind through tall grass, ever present but gentle. In town, folks stared. Me hadn't been seen with company since before Eli vanished, and Jonah looked like a man who'd seen the worst the world had to offer and survived by turning half to stone. She let them stare, bought her flour and salt and coffee while Jonah checked the saddlebags and kept watch at the stable gate. As they rode out, he said, "They think I'm bad for you." Me raised an eyebrow. "They're not wrong to think it." He gave a quiet laugh. "Then why'd you bring me?" "Because I didn't want to be alone on the ride." They crested the ridge just as the sun dipped low, painting the land in gold and rust. Jonah pulled his horse alongside hers and nodded toward the valley. "I've been thinking of heading south come summer," he said. Me felt the words settle in her gut like a stone in water. "You healed enough for that." "Nearly." She kept her eyes on the path. "You running from something?" "No, not anymore." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but that night, as me washed the dishes, she asked, "If you find him, if Eli's still alive, what would you say?" Jonah leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. His voice was quiet. "I'd tell him I made it because of him, and that I tried to become someone he wouldn't regret saving." Me dried her hands on her apron. "That's not a small thing." "No," he agreed, "it's not." Rain fell again that night, steady and warm. In the dark, me dreamed of Eli, older than when he left, eyes shadowed but steady. In the dream, he stood beside Jonah beneath the pinyon tree, one hand resting on his shoulder. When she woke, Jonah was already up, fixing the roof where the leak had started to run again. She brought him coffee in a battered tin cup, and neither of them said a word. But the way he took it from her, the way their hands touched for the briefest moment, said plenty. The summer settled in slow, heavy with heat and the smell of sage. Dust curled from the dry trail like breath, and the sun burned long and low over the mesa each evening. Me traded her long sleeves for lighter cotton, though she still wore her husband's duster to market. Some habits clung like burrs. Jonah grew stronger. The limp stayed subtle but constant, but his hands no longer shook, and his voice carried easier across the yard. He spent afternoons tending the garden without being asked. Sometimes he'd sing under his breath, old trail songs, mournful and spare. Me listened from the porch, her mending in her lap and Nash asleep at her feet. She never joined in. She didn't sing anymore. One morning in June, a rider came. Me saw the dust long before the shape. A single figure, lean and sharp, moving too fast for a neighbor and too straight to be lost. She had the rifle slung across her shoulder before they even cleared the fence line. Jonah stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His face changed when he saw the man, something wary, something older than he looked. The rider dismounted slow, one hand raised in peace. He wore a badge pinned to his vest, tarnished but real. "Looking for a man might have passed through here. Calls himself Jonah Price," the marshal said. Me stood still. Jonah's mouth was a tight line. "Name doesn't ring," she said. The marshal looked between them. "Robbery out near Lincoln. 2 dead. Some say a man limped away into the snow." Me's hand tightened on the rifle. "I wasn't near Lincoln," Jonah said, stepping forward. "I haven't held iron in months." The marshal's gaze swept over him. "Your face matches the ledger, eyes especially." Jonah didn't flinch. "I've done things I ain't proud of, but not that." "Funny," the marshal said. "Every man says that." Me stepped down from the porch. "He's been here since winter, near dead when he came. I stitched him myself." The marshal studied her. "You sure about who you're harboring?" "I'm sure enough." A long silence stretched. Finally, the marshal spat in the dust. "You don't see him again, you send word to Carson." He mounted, turned his horse. "Wouldn't be the first thief found nursing a new name on a kind widow's land." Me didn't move until the rider was a speck on the far ridge. Jonah let out a slow breath. I didn't kill those men. I believe you, Me said, but her voice had a tremor, not of doubt, of fear. The kind born when the past drags claws across the threshold. That night she made stew and set 2 bowls down. Jonah sat slow, heavy with thought. I could leave, he said. You could, she replied. But, she met his eyes. But that marshal didn't ride all this way just on rumor, someone's still hunting. Jonah looked down at his hands. They won't stop. No, she said, they won't. The wind shifted that week, hot and dry from the east. Fires broke out near the timber line. Jonah helped dig a fire break around the edge of Me's land, hacking at roots with silent determination. After a long day's labor, he handed her a bundle, leather-wrapped, worn from travel. What is it? She asked. My ledger, he said, the one we took from the men buying children. Names, numbers, enough to burn half the territory's shame into daylight. Me turned it over in her hands. Why give it to me? Because if I'm caught, they'll bury it with me. She stared at the bundle. It felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. What do you want me to do with it? Whatever your heart says, Jonah replied. That night she hid it beneath a loose board in the floor, beneath where her son's cot still stood. The days grew longer, peaches ripened, crickets sang in the dark. And one afternoon, as Jonah repaired the far fence, Nash began barking. Me came to the door, heart hammering, and stopped cold. A rider approached, but not a stranger. He dismounted slow, moving stiff, as an old tree bent by wind. Me's breath caught. The man lifted his hat. Mars. It was Eli. Older, scarred, but standing. Behind him, dust shimmered like heat on stone. Jonah dropped the hammer in his hand and stared. Eli looked past his mother, past the dog, to the man standing still as carved wood. Jonah, he said, voice soft, like he was naming something holy. And Jonah took a step forward, the sun crowning him like firelight. I thought you were dead. I was close, Eli said, but I owed someone my life, figured it was time I came home and paid it. Me stepped down from the porch, knees weak, her voice barely held. You came back. Eli looked at her, eyes full. I never left you in my heart. She touched his face, like she couldn't believe the skin was real. Then she turned to Jonah, her eyes wet but sure. I took in a thief, she said, but I think I kept something more. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The house breathed different with Eli back beneath its roof. Not louder, he spoke little like her, but fuller, like a wound starting to knit itself from the inside. He moved through the rooms like someone remembering the weight of walls, the creak of floorboards, the smell of cedar and ash. Nash followed him everywhere, nose pressed to his boots like scent alone could make up for 5 lost years. Me kept her joy close to the chest. She lived too long with absence to trust reunion completely. At night, she'd wake and press her palm to the doorframe, just to hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing through the wall. She didn't ask why he'd stayed away. And he didn't offer more than she needed. But sometimes she caught him watching Jonah with an expression that was neither resentment nor pity. It was something older than both, recognition. They worked together now, side by side in the field. Me could see the difference in their ways, Eli careful, methodical, every movement weighed. Jonah faster, rougher, a man who'd learned to fix things that should have been thrown away. Yet they moved in rhythm. Where one paused, the other filled the silence. It was mid-July when Eli handed me a tin of letters, her own, returned unopened, the handwriting hers, the paper faded by years of writing. He held them out without a word. She didn't open them. Just pressed them to her chest and nodded once, her eyes full. Some truths didn't need reading to be understood. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the pasture, Jonah found Eli on the porch sharpening his knife. Me was inside, setting dough for morning bread. Jonah sat beside him, shoulders aching from hauling stone. I never thought I'd see you again, he said. Eli didn't look up, me neither. You saved my life. You saved mine more than once. Jonah shook his head. Not the same. Eli stopped sharpening. His voice was low. It is to me. They sat there a while, watching the sky darken. Later that night, Me took down the ledger Jonah had given her, set it on the table between them, and looked to both men. I think it's time, she said. Eli's brow furrowed. Time for what? For this to do what it was meant to do. Jonah leaned forward. You sure? Me nodded. We've all lived too long with ghosts. It's time the world met some of them. They made the ride to Santa Fe together, turned the ledger over to a circuit judge who remembered Eli's name and did not smile when he read it. The days that followed were quiet and tense, and when the judge called them back, he spoke slow. There'll be men who want your heads for this, but there'll be more who owe you thanks. He turned to Jonah. You'll be hunted less now, not never, but less. They returned home under a sky clean and clear, thunderclouds piled high on the distant horizon. That autumn Me built a new shed with Jonah and Eli, 3 hammers swinging, 3 shadows stretching across the ground. The orchard bore fruit. They canned for winter, stacked firewood high, mended the barn roof for good. In the quiet hours, Me sometimes sat beside the fire and watched the way Jonah glanced to Eli before speaking, the way Eli leaned toward him when he laughed. It wasn't loud, their love, wasn't easy either, but it grew between them steady as moss on stone. One cold morning, after the first frost, Me found them both in the pasture. Eli sat on the split-rail fence, Jonah leaning beside him, their shoulders touching like it was the most natural thing in the world. Storm's coming, Jonah said. Eli nodded. We're ready. Me stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour, heart quiet for the first time in years. She had taken in a thief on death's door. But what she kept was something else entirely. Not a thief. Not a ghost. Not even just a son returned. She kept the beginning of something whole. Something worth staying for.